Let's take this further now with Professor Caradee Wright. Caradee, we've of course heard your brief input in our insert. Can you break down in a little bit more depth why would climate change, so a warmer Earth, make air pollution worse?
So there's two ways that climate change is going to make air pollution levels worse than what we're seeing now. The first is the temperature in the atmosphere is changing. And with the change in temperature, the chemistry of how things are made up changes. And when the conditions are just right, certain chemicals can break down and reform into different chemicals, and this then generates air pollution. So that's the one way that it happens. The other is more related to behavioral change. So in a warmer climate or in a cooler climate, because in fact climate change doesn't just mean warming, we can also still get cold snaps, people will resort to burning of potentially solid fuel like wood or coal or kerosene, paraffin and so on, as a means to heat their homes, or when there's a shortage of electricity, the means to cook. And these activities within the homes then produce air pollution, which then goes outside and increases these air pollution levels.
You've also mentioned that people who already have lung problems because of air pollution will now suffer more because when it's warmer, your body now needs to cope with the heat, and it could also trigger, for instance, you mentioned an asthma attack. So what does that mean for our health system?
This is a grave challenge for our healthcare system. We know that the health system in South Africa is already triply burdened, not just because of the caseload, but because of the capacity in terms of staff shortages, as well as stockouts in terms of drugs. So if we are going to see an influx of people who are struggling during periods of intense heat, which does exacerbate certain respiratory illnesses, we are not going to be able to serve those people in the way that they need it with the immediate attention to try and prevent further adverse effects. So there's a lot that needs to be done in terms of preparing our healthcare system as a whole, in terms of the infrastructure, the buildings, the capacity among our staff, the skills and the knowledge to recognize the types of illnesses that are going to be triggered during these types of heatwave events.
Things like pandemics or events like climate change almost always do is that they show us in which world we live, what that world looks like, so they magnify the problems that we have. So how do we deal with climate change within the context of inequality?
The changes that we've seen in our communities in terms of socioeconomic status, not only during the pandemic, but pre-pandemic and continuing on today, means that certain people are not able to have the adaptive capacity or the agency to implement changes themselves in their own lives to protect their health. That means they need to rely on the healthcare system and services to give them either the preventative medication or the treatment that they need to ensure that their health and well-being is maintained. Going forward, because we're going to see an increase in these cases, it's very concerning that we are not necessarily going to be able to help the people who need the help the most. South Africa is one of the most unequal countries in the world, according to our Gini coefficient. And this is going to only be exacerbated in the face of a changing climate.
So we should, in effect, use climate change to speed up our efforts to address inequality that was already there before climate change, but that will be made worse by climate change.
That's exactly right. And this is something like what the World Health Organization proposes, that you have health in all policies. And what we are lobbying for now is climate change to be addressed in all policies because it affects every aspect of life.
Can you give me an example of where climate change needs to be worked in where it wasn't previously?
So, for example, in the food chain, keeping food cool throughout the process from farm to fork, essentially, is tricky when temperatures are warmer. But we need safe food for people to eat, to keep and maintain their health. So an example of that is using different energy sources to fuel the cooling refrigeration in these trucks. And we hope one day we'll get to the point where we'd see something like solar power being used. At the moment, there's introduction of electrical powering of these vehicles. That's just one way in which we are trying to adapt through the policy of the National Climate Change and Health Adaptation Plan onto something in the ground to try and help people's health.
Caradee Wright, thanks very much for making the time for us today.
You're most welcome. Thank you.
After the break, we speak to Kumi Naidu, a climate justice activist. Stay with us.